Good evening and welcome to the Forum at Friendship, the monthly evening program of the Forum at Friendship. My name is Tom Buchanan. I am the pastor at Friendship Church in Athens, Georgia, and I am very excited to introduce to all of you my good friend Carl McColman. Carl is an Atlanta-based Christian contemplative author, speaker, and retreat leader. He regularly leads programs for Columbia Theological Seminary, their Center for Lifelong Learning, and for many other churches and retreat centers. He spoke on Celtic spirituality just this past March at Friendship. He is the author of many books, including An Invitation to Celtic Wisdom, Eternal Heart, and we're going to say more about this later tonight, the new big book of Christian mysticism. You can learn more about Carl after the program is over tonight by visiting his website at www.animcara.com. Animcara is a Gaelic word for soul friend, I believe. Animcara is spelled ANAMCHARA. animcara.com. Carl, welcome.
Oh, thanks, Tom. It's great to be here tonight. Thank you so much.
Well, it's great to have you. As I mentioned before, you were at Friendship Church speaking in person back in March, and you were quite a hit. And I have been aching to get you back, and I'm glad that we can do this here. It turns out it's just as well that it is by Zoom, because as Carl was telling me, Carl has COVID right now, and
well, I'm getting over COVID, but still, yeah. If I was in person, I'd be masked. So
yeah. So we're glad that you can be with us, and glad you don't have to be masked either. So
yeah.
Carl just got back from Ireland. He may very well tell us a little bit about that as well. So anyway, and needless to say, I love hearing stories about his travels in Scotland and whatnot. So all right.
Yeah.
Well, to give you an idea of what you can expect for the next hour and 15 minutes or so, this is largely going to take the form of a conversation. Carl and I are going to start the conversation off, and I have a few questions that I want to ask him to get us all into the spirit, so to speak. But as we go along, I very much encourage any of you to raise a question if you have one, or certainly to contribute to the conversation. Bob Barr, there are some directions in this conversation that will reflect the conversation that you and I had about 2 weeks ago. Actually, yeah, about a week and a half ago. And you'll notice a couple of places, and I would love for you to chime in when you recognize those notes, to chime in and to follow up with your own thoughts or your own questions. All right, but the same goes for all of you. All of you, please feel free. This is an open conversation with a wonderful conversationalist in Carl. Well, as you all know, the title of this conversation tonight, of this program, is The Future of Christian Spirituality. And if you recall the flyer that all of you received in being invited to this event, you may remember a quote that serves as something of an explanation or a basis for this title, The Future of Christian Spirituality. It was a quote by a 20th century Catholic theologian named Karl Rahner. And the quote goes like this: "The Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all." Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all. Carl, that's a provocative saying, I would say. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I mean, we could spend the whole time just trying to unpack the word mystic, so we certainly can go there. But but let me kind of set the stage, because Ronner wrote that in an essay called "The Future of the Church" or "The Future of Christianity" back in 1965 or so. Ronner was one of the big theologians at the Vatican II Council in Rome in the 1960s, which people who know their modern church history knows that's kind of when the Catholic Church tried to come into the 20th century with some success. You know, it let go of the Latin Mass and went into doing Mass in the local languages, and they stopped calling Protestants heretics, you know, and basically said, you know, we recognize that other religions exist and that's cool, et cetera, et cetera. So there, you know, it was a major time of kind of transformation within the Catholic world. And so Ronner, who again was a very well-respected theologian, writes this essay where he talks about his predictions about the future of Christianity. And it's a fascinating essay. He basically predicts the internet. He, you know, in the 1960s, he talks about in the future, there will be a global communications network that will link people from all over the planet together, and that it will allow people with very specific interests to find each other. You know, you read that. The first time I read that, I was just like, oh my God, it's social media. You know, he's predicting this in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say that Christianity will lose its kind of social prestige that it held, at least in Europe and North America, for many centuries. And I think we certainly can say that that has come to pass in our culture as well. And he also talks about the demise of what has been called the cultural Christian. You know, the person who, you know, goes to church because it's kind of the thing you do. You know, it's what, you know, my mom and dad went to church, my grandparents went to church. You know, everybody from work goes to church. It's where I can network. It's kind of what you do. 50 or 60 years ago, I think that a lot of people who were sitting in the pews on Sunday morning, that was really who they were.
Mhm.
Those people are gone.
Yeah.
Those people are gone. And Ronner, I think, nailed it by
They're playing
saying
golf
we're
on Sunday
basically.
morning.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
They're playing golf on Sunday morning.
They're playing golf, or they've taken their kids to soccer matches or
Or a soccer
whatever.
match.
And
Right.
you know, and so the reality is, I mean, we have seen this. How many churches, their memberships are aging, are declining, churches are closing. There is this incredible demographic shift that really since 9/11 has kind of been accelerated, you know. And so I think the warning part of Ronner's statement is proved to be prophetic.
Yeah.
That
Well, that was
we
actually kind of where I wanted to go a little bit, was just to understand, because I was unaware of the essay. I did not know
Mhm.
the context of the quote.
Yeah.
I
Uh-huh.
was wondering if what Ronner was saying was descriptive or prescriptive. You
Yeah.
know, was he stating as a matter of fact that in fact they're going to be a very, very small number of Christians, and those that are Christians are going to be mystics? Or is he actually prescribing a remedy for
Yeah.
the decline of faith in a secular world?
You know,
Well,
and I
I would
think
say if we're going to have to be mystics, I'm out. I mean, that's really kind of a
oh
narrow corridor we got here. Sorry, but I know.
well,
Well,
I'm I'm
that's
gonna
I
I'm
wonder.
I'm gonna
I'm
say
kind of
that the hour is young, and maybe after you hear me out, maybe you won't say that you can't be a mystic, because I think Ronner represents a particular understanding of spirituality and mysticism that I think is worth all of us reflecting on. So that's where I want to go. But I was starting with the bad news, okay? And so and I think we can all agree. You know, I don't know about in Athens, but in Atlanta, you see churches getting boarded up.
Hmm.
You know, and there's a church, then it's boarded up, then the wrecking ball shows up, and then a year later there's a shopping center. You know, so the reality of kind of the condensation the withdrawing or the shrinking of at least institutional Christianity is just a fact. We can argue about why it's happening, but I don't think anybody can argue that it's happening.
Yeah.
So back to your question, Tom. I do think he's being somewhat descriptive. And I think that, again, and this is where I think that Sarah, is that your name?
Sarah, yes.
Yeah, Sarah's comment is what I really want to drill in. And Sarah, I'm really happy that you made that comment, because this is something that I have seen again and again, is that many people, many very active, engaged, don't miss a Sunday kind of Christians, if you say to them, God wants you to be a mystic, they'll say, no, 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 that's not who I am. And I think that it depends on what we mean when we use that word. So I really want to try to unpack the word. So that's the first piece of it. And one of the reasons why we called this talk tonight The Future of Christian Spirituality was I thought if we called it The Future of Christian Mysticism, nobody would show up. But, so there's a little bit of bait and switch going on. But spirituality and mysticism in some ways are parallel words. And then I hope we can explore that.
Well, yeah.
So
in fact, before you do that, real quick, because I noticed in some of the stuff that you've written, you seem to use the word mysticism and the phrase contemplative spirituality almost interchangeably. Is that an accurate read?
And that gives you a real clue into where I'm coming from. And obviously, let's lay these cards on the table. Mysticism is a terrible word.
Okay.
It's a terrible word that gets used by a variety of different, kind of thinkers in different contexts. The word actually comes out of the Greek tradition. It's not a word you find in the New Testament. It's certainly not a word you find in the Old Testament. In the Jewish tradition and in the Sufi or Muslim tradition, when that word gets used, a lot of times people will be very critical of it. And they'll say, wait a minute, that's not a word out of our tradition. So in Christianity, it was a word that kind of got borrowed because of the Greek word for mystery or the Greek word for mute. And that's, and the linking is the same. So you have in the early centuries of Christianity, you have this idea of mystical theology or mystical ways of reading the Bible. The sacraments are referred to as the mysteries, the mystical sacraments, if you will. So what are we talking about here? So the word, again, think of mystery and think of mute, like the mute button on your phone. So it has to do with silence, and it also has to do with that which is beyond, easy comprehension. And so when we talk about mystical spirituality, we're talking about a spirituality that cannot be put into words. A spirituality that and this is the irony of even having this conversation tonight, to talk about it is on some fundamental level to betray it. That really probably the most direct way of appreciating kind of the mystical life would be to be a monk, would be to live a life that is immersed in silence, immersed in contemplation. So again, back to your question, is mysticism and contemplation the same thing? Here's a maybe a handy way to think about that, Tom. Mysticism is the theory, contemplation is the practice.
Okay.
So when we talk about mysticism, we are talking about philosophy, theology. We're talking about ideas that have come down over the centuries that different people have come up with. How do human beings relate to God? How does God express God's self to us? All of this is where mysticism kind of kicks in. But then the question becomes, how do we, as people who have discerned a call to be in a relationship with God in our lives, how do we respond? How do we respond to God's call? And so contemplation is not the only way to respond to God's call, but it is certainly one way. And again, here's a word that's not in the Bible. But what contemplation refers to, elements of contemplation are found throughout the Bible, both the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament. So, so I hope we can unpack a little bit of that as well. this idea, that the classic verse is from Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. This idea, and I know we've got a rabbi on the call tonight, so I'm always a little nervous about talking about
you,
the Hebrew scriptures, but so if I need to be corrected, I will humbly listen. But this idea, my understanding of Psalm 46 is that verse has this sense of laying down your arms, being undefended. To be still is to cease our striving, to cease that quality that can lead to conflict or lead to to struggle. And then in that still silent place, we are invited to truly know the divine presence. That's the contemplative act in a nutshell. And so this idea that that this is part of what we are called to do. Now, the irony of it, of course, certainly within the Christian world, is that we've often ignored that. Christianity is a very talkative religion and has been very, very noisy, at many times. And so, so there's a level on which we have this tradition of silence, of stillness, of meditation, of contemplation, but it's tended to be on the margins. It's tended to be kind of on the edge. So back to Karl Rahner, I think what Karl Rahner is saying is we need to take the contemplative, the mystical out of the monastery, out of the desert, the desert mothers and fathers, and try to bring it back into the hearts of ordinary, everyday people of faith, people like the people on this call tonight. And so, and again, we can talk about, well, what would that look like? But I do think there's a real invitation here for us.
One thing that and Bob, please chime in with anything that you've got or any amplification of what I'm about to say. But the essence of what Bob and I talked about at lunch about a week and a half ago was the fact that part and parcel of people's disenchantment with religious institutions and disaffection from is that those religious institutions are not delivering experiences of God. Religious institutions are great at talking about God, but they're not great at helping people to actually experience God, to actually rest in the presence of God and have some sense of the presence of the holy. And with the idea that if one does experience that is a self-authenticating experience. You don't need anybody to tell you that it's worth pursuing. If you've experienced it, you already know it's worth pursuing, but that our religious institutions do a lot of talking about God, but don't deliver nearly as much in the way of experiencing God. And those churches, churches, many different churches are subject to many different kinds of critique. Okay.
Sure.
But arguably, one of the things, and you could argue whether they do it authentically or inauthentically, but the fact is that there are many churches out there that are bucking the trend, are growing. And part of why they are is that they are serving up. They may be, again, you can question what they're serving up exactly, but what they are selling is experience. Yeah, look at the growth of Pentecostalism in out in the world. Pentecostalism,
Southern Hemisphere.
Whatever critiques you might offer of it, Pentecostalism is offering people intense experiences of the holy, and that's attractive.
Sure.
I think that what mysticism is about, or what contemplative spirituality is perhaps a quieter way relative to Pentecostalism, perhaps, but is perhaps a quieter path towards that same kind of experience of going, as you say, going beyond words, going beyond concepts, and going straight into the presence of God to the point that one feels in communion with God or at one with God.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot there to play with, Tom.
Yeah.
And the first thing I'll say, and yet, certainly charismatic Pentecostal, neo-Pentecostal spirituality has seen incredible growth in the last, 50 to 125 years.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, how sustainable is that?
Mm-hmm.
And that it does seem to be almost experience for its own sake. And it certainly tends to be married to a certain kind of theology,
Right.
that I'm not sure how sustainable that theology is over the long haul. So, so there is that question at play there. So we'll bracket that, but I do agree with your basic thesis that because it presents an experiential kind of entry into what it means to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ. I remember when I was a kid, the big church in the town where I grew up in was the non-denominational charismatic church. Everybody went because it was just so much fun. But that's the thing, it was fun. It was like religion is entertainment.
Right.
And so so that's my concern there, is that I wonder how sustainable
and
it is.
that's where I think the question of authenticity is important, because it's not obvious to me that what they're serving up is necessarily an authentic experience of God. It could just be, heightened nerves, heightened emotions,
It's a Taylor Swift concert, hey,
right.
rock and roll, Taylor Swift's making a lot of money, but
Right.
let's be real, that is it's pretty hyped up. The interesting question is, what is the long-term, possibilities here? And so I do think that there are forces at play. Let me tell a story. So I just came back from Dublin, and I was speaking at a church in Dublin, a wonderful church, a Roman Catholic church, and the priest there is very, very committed to meditation, to kind of a contemplative approach to spirituality. He actually was a monk for 5 years and eventually decided he wasn't called to be a monk for life, so he left the monastery, went back into just congregational parish ministry. But what he's doing now is, at the end of every mass, they have 3 minutes of silence. They have a silent mass every Tuesday night. They have centering prayer every Tuesday morning. They are teaching centering prayer. They're encouraging the parishioners to practice centering prayer. Now, I wish I could tell you that the church was bursting at the seams. It's not. And what he basically, and he's a wonderful guy, he basically said, listen, there are forces at play here that are bigger than me and bigger than this parish. And because of those forces, we can only do so much. But in the meantime, we've got to take a stand. If religion is just, going through the motions and the last one out, turn off the light, how's that being faithful? And so I really, really admire his commitment to, let's try to be as faithful as we can to what the tradition teaches us. And just maybe, somebody's lives will be touched. And, and again, you have to look at this from a long-term perspective. It might very well be that 10 years from now, that church will be doing a lot better than other churches in the neighborhood. Time will tell,
Practically
so
speaking, go ahead. You were finishing.
No. Finish
okay.
your thought.
Well, I was going to ask, what does because you brought up a church parish, a particular church, and it makes me think, what would a commitment to a contemplative expression of faith, and a contemplative spiritual path, what would that look like practically in the life of a congregation, and then narrowed down, what would that look like in the life of an individual believer?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, are you familiar with the book The Lexus and the Olive Tree?
Yes,
yeah, it's a book about globalization,
Yeah.
and it looks at the difference between, you know, the current kind of capitalist model of product innovation, where you have this idea for a product and you need to have it, in the showroom within 6 months. Compare that to planting an olive tree, where a farmer who plants an olive tree is doing it for his grandchildren or their grandchildren. And so right away, this is part of what we're up against, is that we live in a culture that demands results in 6 months.
Right.
And yet I believe Christian spirituality is more like an olive tree than like a Lexus factory.
Mhm.
And so, so the first thing I would say is that I think we have to be somewhat willing to be more committed to our faithfulness and less committed to short-term results.
The poet Wendell Berry spoke of planting sequoias.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That will not reach their maturity for 1,000 years. I mean,
Right.
that kind of thing. And so it is the faith that we are being called to express is a faith that will not necessarily yield results in our lifetime. And that's very challenging. It certainly is not easy on the ego.
Mm-hmm.
So the question becomes, are we willing to take a long view of history? Are we willing to look at the stories that have come down from us generation after generation, going all the way back to Moses and the burning bush, and where we see men, women, people of every generation who have these extraordinary encounters with the holy, with the sacred, with the divine, and those encounters change people's lives, lead people to prophetic actions in the service of justice and community, and and play the long game. And if we're willing to be faithful to that, in the short term, I think we'll see mixed results. But I do believe that in the long term, history has proven that that's the kind of gesture of faithfulness that God ultimately blesses, generation after generation after generation. Monks are a wonderful example here. And I can tell you, I mean, you're in Athens, I'm in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and between us is the Trappist Monastery.
Yeah.
And, in 1970, they had 95 monks, and now I think they have 25. And the average age is probably somewhere between 75 and 80. Like many monasteries throughout North America and Europe, they're experiencing contraction. And if you talk to the monks, I mean, they're human beings. Of course, they would be like, we would love vocations. We would love to share our life with men who would be drawn to this lifestyle. But they also have this incredible sense of, God's in control here. And our job is not to just go out and beat the bushes and get a bunch of warm bodies in here. Our job is to be faithful to the lifestyle that we've been called to lead. And if it's God's will that this monastery closes, the monastery is going to close. And if it's God's will that maybe 200 years from now, the monastery will be reborn. I mean, we've seen that happen too, And so I think this is one of the things that if we want to make a commitment to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, the best thing we can do is to be as faithful as we possibly can. Yeah. Now, what that means is, and this is where it gets difficult, because I think a lot of Christians associate being faithful with, going out and getting more and more people to come and give their lives to Jesus. I think that's misguided. I think being faithful means that we live lives of radical love and service and a commitment to justice. And then we can let the Holy Spirit work in people's hearts, whether, people are drawn to become Christian or not. I'm radically committed, and anyone who knows me knows I'm radically committed to the plurality of faiths in our society, and so, so the whole idea of what am I going to go tell all my Buddhist friends that God doesn't love them unless they become a Christian? That's absurd. But unfortunately, that's where a lot of people think being a faithful Christian is. We have got to let go of that. We have got to go back to what Jesus taught us, which is love your neighbor. forgive 70 times 70, be people of mercy, be people of justice, be committed to community. Those are the things where we are called to embody our faith. Now, add on to that the topic that we brought up tonight, and that is this idea of, where does prayer play into this, and what does prayer look like? And I think the problem is, again, we tend to associate prayer with us talking to God.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, God doesn't get a word in edgewise. So this is why I think the commitment to silence, the commitment to contemplation, meditation, to that deep cultivating of the silent heart becomes just an absolutely essential practice. And it's not something you master in a weekend. It's not like I can teach a workshop, become a mystic in 48 hours. I mean, there are people out there who do stuff like that. I wouldn't give them a penny. But but I think I've jokingly said I want to put together a workshop that says become a mystic in 30 years, or something like that. That the mystical life, the contemplative life, is, to quote the late great Eugene Peterson, it's a long obedience in the same direction. It's something that we slowly cultivate the same way Wendell Berry cultivates that sequoia, or that farmer in Italy cultivates that olive tree.
You said something a second ago that really got my attention, and I want to follow up on it. And it's, you rather explicitly connected the practice of a contemplative spirituality with the pursuit of justice,
mm-hmm.
with an active life in the world pursuit of justice.
Yep.
And I think some people would think of contemplative spirituality as a retreat from the world,
sure,
going into monasteries and cloistering oneself off. And yet there are some very, very significant voices, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, who are wonderful examples of exactly the opposite conclusion, that contemplative spirituality actually fuels a constructive and prophetic stance towards the world. Tell me more about that.
Well, first of all, I do think that different individuals in different communities have different vocations. Okay. And so, the Trappists are a great example, that they lead a cloistered life. It is a withdrawn life. It is a deeply silent life. But even the Trappists, if you go out to Conyers, every Tuesday they run a food bank. Mm-hmm. I worked for the monks for 8 years, and I can tell you, if somebody washed up on their doorstep, somebody who was dealing with alcoholism, or somebody who had lost their job, lost their house, the monks did what they could to take care of that person. It was like it was a non-starter. Dorothy Day, the famous Catholic social activist, used to come to the monastery, and she and Father Anthony would just drive around Rockdale County giving away food.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just the way they lived. And so it was very quiet. The last thing they wanted was PR about this, but it was like, that's just who they were. And if you look at the history of mystical Christianity, you see this again and again and again. I'm thinking of Catherine of Genoa, who was a great mystic in the 15th century, so the 1400s. She started the first hospital in the town of Genoa. And so, you see this kind of thing. So many of the hospitals and the orphanages and the social services that began, in Europe, certainly, and North America as well, oftentimes the people that began them it was out of a faith-based orientation.
Yeah.
So it's nothing new that there's this relationship between a deep intentional spirituality and a commitment to social justice. But I think you're right. I think because of some of the big name contemplatives, the big name mystics, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Thomas Merton, people like that who lived those deeply contemplative lives, that it's gotten this kind of reputation that contemplation is like this retreat from the world. But then we need, for every one of those, there's a Howard Thurman,
Mhm.
or a Simone Weil or a Teilhard de Chardin. You know, there have been other just as important mystics who were absolutely immersed. I mean, Howard Thurman is such a great example, not the
Yeah.
least of which is because he has ties to Atlanta. So he's
Right.
one of our own, you know.
Exactly.
But here's this Black Baptist preacher. His grandmother was a slave, grew up in the Jim Crow South, graduate of Morehouse College, then goes up to New York to get his seminary training, becomes a Baptist preacher, and you know, and just eventually helps to start the first integrated church in San Francisco back in the 1940s, you know, 20 years before Martin Luther King. He actually was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. Um, and so if you read his writing is filled with this incredible call into silence, call into the silent place in our hearts.
Yeah.
And yet he also was absolutely uncompromising in his commitment to social justice and particularly to racial justice in America
Yeah.
today. So he is such a great example of how the contemplative spiritual invitation is not as an alternative to the call to justice, but really they go hand in hand. And I think what Howard Thurman would have said is that if you don't have the contemplative, then the work for social justice could lead to burnout.
Right.
It could lead just to anger and frustration. I mean, I think we see it in America today, where we see people on both sides of political divide getting angrier and angrier and angrier at each other. And nobody is talking, nobody is really engaged in how can we listen to one another? How can we find common ground? If we can't agree on everything, what can we agree on? Those conversations aren't happening. And I think the reason they're not happening is because very few people are really taking the time to listen to their hearts. That's what's missing in our culture today. And again, I think it's up to us, up to people of faith. We have to lead the way. If it's not us, then who? You know?
Yeah. Well, I think it's absolutely the case that a contemplative spirituality, a contemplative approach to the Christian life is absolutely the answer to so much that travails the progressive church. In that, you know, I see the progressive church as a group of social justice oriented, very well-meaning people, very well-meaning people who are, two things are true of many folks in the progressive church, is they're angry and burned out. I mean, they're simply exhausted.
Yeah.
And I understand that completely. They are
compassion fatigue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And while I don't know how many would admit to this, but I think it's true, because I understand this kind of on a deep level in my own life, is that the figure of God is reduced to something of a figurehead rather than being an active living presence empowering the pursuit of justice. So it's kind of like, you know, there's a lot of sincerity. There's a lot of sincerity and a lot of well-meaningness, but there's not a lot of gas in the tank. And there's not much to sustain it beyond anger. There's not much to sustain it beyond anger. And this is what I think, you know, somebody like Thomas Merton understood so well, precisely for the reasons that you said earlier about, you know, that contemplatives are playing the long game, you know, and that you have to have, I mean, Thomas Merton had that wonderful letter to a young activist. I'm sure you've heard of that classic.
Oh yeah.
Where he's talking to he's writing a letter to a young activist who is discouraged and burned out, and he's involved in the anti-war, the peace movement, that kind of thing, during Vietnam, but he's discouraged and he's tired, and Merton is basically saying, you know, look, you've got to focus on the rightness of your calling, the rightness of the task at hand, and then trust God, look to God, trust in God to sustain you, all along the way. And I think that's just such an important message, and it's such a vital well of spiritual sustenance that those in the progressive church so desperately need.
And I'm not here to take shots at the progressive church, and trust me, we could take shots at the
I just took
conservative
it to you.
church.
I just took
All
it
right.
to you. Yeah.
Well, but let's, but I think the
as one
concern
from the inside, as from the inside.
Yeah. I think the concern, and of course I'm Roman Catholic, where you do have a progressive wing, but you also have a very large conservative wing too. And it seems to me that what you have is that both the progressive wing of the universal church and the conservative wing of the universal church, that they both have distorted images of God. And so that's one of the things I think we have to talk about. And I had an Episcopal priest say to me 40 years ago, he said, my congregation is functionally deist. And I think, if anything, in the last 40 years, that has become even more the case in many, many, progressive mainline Protestant
Define
churches.
that word.
Well, a deist would be kind of like, well, we believe in God, but God is kind of up there. God kind of created the universe, and then God's not really involved. God just kind of watches, and it's really up to us to get things done. And if we don't do it, it's not going to happen. And, and we can pray to God, but that's just to make ourselves feel better. God's not going to intervene. That's this is the theology of Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers of the United States. And so, so I think what happened is the conservative Christian wing has weaponized God so much, and that God has been the implacable foe of queer people, the implacable foe of abortion, the implacable foe of, anybody who disobeys, that the liberal wing of the church has rightly rejected that God, but then they've replaced it with a God who is essentially empty.
Yeah.
As a spiritual director of mine once said, a blah God.
Right.
And so, so I think this is really an interesting question is, can we dare to believe in a God who will radically be there? To back to Howard Thurman, for the oppressed, radically be there for the disinherited, for the people who lack social privilege, the people whose backs are against the wall. And I will say this too, and I'm including myself in here. Mainline American Protestants and liberal Catholics, we tend to be pretty comfortable, economically comfortable. I've got male privilege, I've got white privilege. I've got pretty much the whole set of privileges, and so I live a comfortable life. I'm college educated, I'm not wealthy by Warren Buffett standards, but by global standards, I'm pretty comfortable, and so the reality is that sometimes maybe when we're this comfortable, we don't have a reason to really sit and absolutely give everything to God, because that's all you've got left. And so, this is one of the reasons why I think those of us who do have privilege, one of the things that we have to do is we have to form relationships, meaningful relationships with people who have been forgotten by our culture. Whether it's people of color, whether it's queer people, whether it's, people that are homeless, whatever the situation may be, refugees, etc. Obviously there's a lot of people out there who have been forgotten by our culture. And a lot of them are not Christian and don't want to be Christian. And so this is another thing that we have got to do, is we've got to get over that we're only going to serve people who look and think like us or pray like us. Right. So,
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Golly, this is good stuff. Let me, a lot of this has been between Carl and me. Are there any questions or thoughts that any of you have at this point? I have some more things that I want to bring up, but are there just some questions or topics that anybody has? All right. Well, Carl, one thing I
We
wanted
want to people want to be silent. That's great.
yeah,
We can be
hey,
silent.
that's good. That works, you know. I wanted to go back to yet another thing that you said that I thought was really, really provocative, or at least you made an allusion that I thought was very suggestive. Um, tell me, tell me ways in which the Bible itself expresses this this contemplative call, this call to silence.
Well, one thing I would say is that I think it's kind of in the air in the world of the biblical writers. And so, it's like it's not talked about because it was more or less just lived.
Mhm.
But I do think there's evidence for it. Let's start with the Hebrew scriptures. So there was a rabbi named Aryeh Kaplan who wrote a book called Meditation in the Bible. And I would strongly recommend it. And of course, he's a rabbi. He's writing about the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. But I think every Christian ought to read that book, because what he does is he really, Hebrew word study. So he really gets into the language in the Hebrew Bible to show this incredible kind of presence of meditative spirituality that, especially in the book of Psalms, you find it in Ezekiel, some of the prophetic tradition, that there is just this kind of recognition that meditation is a core spiritual practice. So so that's kind of the starting point. Then if you want to move into the New Testament, and I can proof text you, there's like the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him. The Psalms, lots of verses about silence, lots of verses about waiting in the Psalms. So you get these kind of proof text things. And I know proof texting is dangerous, but I think what taken collectively, they point to just kind of this understanding that silence is the lingua franca of the life of prayer. So this is kind of just this basic understanding. In the New Testament, Jesus, every time you drop a hat, Jesus is running off to pray. He obviously you had the 40 days in the desert. You have, him going off in the morning into the wilderness to be by himself, sending his followers on ahead so he can hold back and pray.
That's one of my
Jesus, Jesus models prayer. And I think, so many Christians, the best-selling Christian book after the Bible is The Imitation of Christ. Why aren't we imitating his prayer practice? This, I think, is a big question that we all need to be asking. Why don't we imitate Jesus's prayer practice?
Yeah.
So, so I think that there's that needs to be said. In the letters of St. Paul, I think it's in I can't remember if it's First Thessalonians, one of the later letters, and maybe one of the pastoral letters, but where he says at one point, he says, you need to learn to be silent. Now, it often gets translated as aspire to lead a peaceful life, which is perfectly fine. But the Greek word that's used there is Hezekiah, which we know from the Orthodox tradition. Hezekiah is basically the word for contemplation.
Right.
So Paul is basically saying, you need to learn to be contemplatives.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there's his famous pray without ceasing.
There's that,
Right? How would you, I mean, I've never asked you this before. How would you interpret that from your perspective, that particular verse, where Paul pray without ceasing?
There's a number of ways you can approach that. And certainly different people through history have tried different ways. The wonderful Russian Orthodox books, The Way of the Pilgrim, is a meditation on somebody trying to take that seriously. How do I do this? So monks, with their rhythm of praying 7 times a day. Of course, that comes from Psalm 119. One of the verses in Psalm 119, 7 times a day do I praise thee, O Lord. So it's like, okay, well, if we pray 7 times a day, we're praying without ceasing. So that's one way of looking at the Jesus prayer. This idea of knitting your prayer in with your very breath, so that literally your breath becomes a prayer, is certainly another way of looking at it. I would argue that I think there's two important elements to praying without ceasing. And the first one is, again, following Jesus. Have a prayer practice like Jesus's. Pray every chance you get. Take time to be alone, take time to withdraw, take time to pray, and then pair that with a prayerful life. So obviously, when you're out there building a habitat house, you're probably not reciting a prayer while you're doing it, but what you're doing is prayer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And you become more conscious of that because you have your own daily prayer practice. Yeah. So praying without ceasing doesn't mean you have to pray 24/7. Nobody does that, but it does mean that prayer needs to be an ongoing, committed part of your life that enables you to see the fullness of your life as a gesture of prayer.
Yeah.
So there was an old contemporary Christian music band back in the 70s that I used to listen to called the Second Chapter of Acts, and they had you remember them? Well, you're almost as old as I am, Tom. But that they had a song called "Make My Life a Prayer to You." I mean, what a beautiful line. Make my life a prayer to you. So that's how I interpret that. But certainly, obviously, different people have tried to unpack that.
Along those lines, someone who very much is in the spirit of what you're talking about tonight is an old mentor of mine. When I was in New Jersey, an Episcopal priest named Robert Corin Morris. I don't know if you've ever heard that name before. Mm-hmm. He's written a number of really wonderful books, and there was one in particular that I recall, and I was trying to look for it. I know it's on my shelf somewhere, and I just can't. Oh, yeah, there it is.
All right.
Yeah, I found it. It's called Wrestling with Grace. Wrestling with Grace, a spirituality for the rough edges of daily life. And Gerald May of the Shalem Institute gave an endorsement of it on the back. One of the things that I remember from this particular book is his suggestions for incorporating prayer into like all the ordinary things you do on a routine basis. So for example, every time you brush your teeth, you think, you meditate as you're brushing your teeth, and you turn it into may my speech be pure, may everything that I say today be a blessing to others, that kind of thing. And you use something that you already do, and use it as an opportunity then to express devotion, to express a prayer. When you shower or take a bath, it's the same kind of idea. When you take your morning walk, when you get in the car, all manner of things you do routinely, you turn them into prayers.
Go ahead.
I know Tom will remember this. I can't help but remember Ray Stover said, every time he stopped at a red light, instead of fussing, say a prayer.
Yes. Keeps you out of trouble.
Well, my wife, whenever she hears a siren, she offers a prayer for, somebody's having a worse day than we are. We're stuck in traffic. But somebody's having a worse day than we are. Can we just pray for that person? And it really does transform your experience of that.
Absolutely.
So I'm reminded, I think in the Jewish tradition, you have a culture of blessings that I think is certainly worth thinking about. And I was looking I couldn't find it, but that wonderful Scottish masterpiece, the Carmina Gadelica, which is a collection of blessings from the Hebrides.
Yeah.
And I mean, score one for the Scots. But and
Tom got it right over there.
It is such a classic book, and literally, of course, it's this agricultural, the island, the fishermen and the crofters, in the islands of Scotland, but they literally had blessings from the morning when you lit the fire, to milking the cow, to to churning the butter. I mean, every little aspect of life, there was
Yeah.
some sort of a blessing, some sort of a prayer that was offered, and so what that does is it sacralizes your day, and
Mhm.
it enchants your life so that you begin to simply kind of calibrate your heart to the idea that literally everything in our lives is a blessing.
Yeah.
And I think we've lost a lot of that to our detriment in our culture. And our again, our deistic Pelagian kind of way of seeing the world, that God is just off in the distance somewhere and it's all up to us.
Yeah.
Rather than, I mean, what's the classic joke about the guy who is, late for a really important meeting and he can't find a parking spot and he doesn't go to church. He's not a very religious man, trying to find the parking spot, late for the meeting. And he's like, Lord, if you give me a parking spot, I'll start going to church. I'll never miss a Sunday. I promise I'll go to church. And he turns the corner and there's an empty spot and he says, never mind, I found one. That's American spirituality in a nutshell.
Right.
It's just,
Yeah.
so.
One thing that I have found that that as I do engage in those kinds of disciplines, I have found that it increases the likelihood that I'm going to see wonder around me. I'm going to see things around me. It's like, and what that teaches me is that we go through so much of our lives in a kind of numbness, a kind of where you talk about where we don't expect anything. We don't expect any. Walter Brueggemann always used the word newness, that we don't expect any newness. And when we pray, it's like we're tuning in. We're tuning in to radio waves that are out there. They're always out there, but unless we're tuned into them, we don't pick them up. We don't hear them. We don't pick them up. And so we go through life then with that. When we pray, when we're training ourselves in a more attentive way, we live with a greater sense of expectancy. We don't, it's always wise not to have too many expectations, not to make demands of life, that life must deliver this, and this, but to go through life with a heightened sense of expectancy, like God is set to surprise me at any moment. Is gonna, that God's blessings are always coming, in many different.
We've lost the sense of God as providence.
Yeah.
Providence is more than just a city in Rhode Island, a beautiful city, I might add. But, why did Roger Lewis call that city Providence? Because that was a way of understanding the divine. And again, I think we've lost it. And for me, what helped was when I went into full-time ministry, and being basically a freelance, a ministerial freelancer, I really had to trust. I didn't know where my next paycheck was coming half the time. I still don't, half the time. And so, learning to trust that sense that, that God cares for us. And that may not necessarily look the way I want it to look, but, it's been 10 years now and I've never gone hungry. I've never missed a mortgage payment. I've never missed a credit card payment, knowing that providence really is there. Now, a cynic could say, yeah, well, you're, again, you have privilege, blah, 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 I know you've worked hard, yada. But I do believe that, sometimes people who don't have the kind of privileges that we have on this call, their faith is even greater than ours. And that they have just seen evidence in their lives again and again and again. I think about, there was this woman, Immaculée Ilibigaza, who was in Rwanda during the genocide, and literally, hid in a bathroom for like 90 days, praying her way through, I mean, was it just luck? Was it grace? Was it providence? I mean, you can get into the whole question of, well, what about all the people who didn't survive? You know, there's, and this is where, again, we're back to mystery, and why mystery is such an essential part of the spiritual life. We don't understand why some people, their cancer goes into remission and other people don't. You know, why, you know, this person is in an accident and they die, and this person is in an accident and they come out of the coma and they heal. None of us can explain any of that.
Yeah.
But if we can approach life's uncertainty with that gesture of faith, that miracles can happen, and even if the worst possible scenario is how it plays out, that I trust that I am being held in the arms of a providential God who loves and cares for me like God loves and cares for everybody. I think that changes everything. And I think it takes the edge off of the angst in our culture. We are an incredibly cynical and an incredibly, incredibly anxious culture. And I think that's why social media is a snake pit, is because the people in social media who are constantly fighting with each other, they are cynical and anxious and afraid. And so, you know, and so again, this is what people of faith, what we have to offer as an alternative is, wait a minute, you know, cynicism and despair and anxiety does not need to be the end of the story. I mean, we all touch places of fear and angst. That's just the human condition, but we don't have to drop anchor there. And that's what I think, you know, having again, a vibrant prayer life calibrates us towards that recognition. But again, it doesn't happen overnight. It's you know, a long obedience in the same direction. It's absolutely is something we have to live in slowly. So.
Let me ask you this. So we're in about the last 10 to 15 minutes of our time. Let me ask you this. I'm listening and I'm thinking to myself, I want to take some steps in the direction of what you're holding out, what you're talking about. What do I do? What steps would you suggest that I take?
Well, let's look at some that we've already touched on tonight. You know, find the silence in your own heart. Take time to befriend silence. Don't be afraid of it. I think a lot of people in our culture are scared of silence. You know, I mentioned I worked at the monastery, and we would have people, they would come to spend the weekend at the monastery. This is God's honest truth. They would come, they would check in, they would get their room key, they would go upstairs, they would get their room, and they would come right back down, and they would say to the receptionist, "There's a problem. My room doesn't have a television." I mean, and I don't mean to just make fun of people, because I think this is emblematic of our culture. And in some cases, those people would leave. You know, it's kind of like, you know, I'm a vegan, so I eat at a lot of vegan restaurants, and it's amazing to see people walk in and get seated at a vegan restaurant, and they look at the menu and they realize there's no meat, and they get up and leave. It's like they didn't even try it. You know, it's like, maybe for one night, can you skip the meat and maybe you'll still be alive in the morning? You know, you might actually, maybe your blood pressure will go down, you know, I mean, you give it a shot. It's the same thing with, you know, so I think the first thing is to find a way to get to know silence. Here's the challenge. Every single one of us, you know, a human being that lives a normal lifespan, let's say 80 years, over the course of a normal lifespan, your heart is going to beat 3 billion times. More, you know, give or take a few million. Your heart's going to beat 3 billion times. In between every one of those heartbeats is a moment of silence. There's a moment of silence. So learn to find the silence in your own heart. Learn to find the silence in between your thoughts. Just get to know the silence that's in your own body. So that's the first thing I'd say. Second thing I would say, and again, speaking specifically in a Christian context, is try to do what Jesus did. You know, be somebody who prays. Be somebody who prays regularly. Be somebody who takes time to be alone with God, to listen for God's voice, to, you know, go on a retreat. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. We can at least spend 3 or 4 days at Ignatius' house or the monastery or someplace like that. You know, cultivate that time of just of listening, of just trying to find the whisper of God inside your own heart. So I think those are two great places to start. Certainly, the good news in this day and age is that there are wonderful resources that didn't exist even a generation ago for Christians who want to dive deeper into the contemplative life. There's a contemplative outreach. There's the World Community for Christian Meditation. Those are two organizations. Contemplative Outreach has a very active chapter here in North Georgia. So that's a great one to start with. They are ecumenical and interfaith. You don't have to be Roman Catholic or Episcopalian or even Christian to participate. And of course the practice is centering prayer, which is a silent prayer practice. It's a silent meditation practice. So, plugging in with something like that. And then, then obviously getting to know the teachings of the great spiritual teachers over the centuries who have, endorsed this kind of a lifestyle. And, obviously I assume you pitched this question to me so that I could end up kind of, pitching my own book. But obviously that was why I wrote my book on Christian mysticism, is to invite people to learn about this tradition, because it is out there, it belongs to everybody, and most people just aren't even familiar with it.
Yeah.
So obviously, it's just getting to know our own history, I think, is a really important step that we can all take.
Well, one book that Carl may or may not have been prepared to bring up, one that I can certainly suggest to anyone who is interested in first steps. Carl even autographed it for me. But Answering the Contemplative Call. Answering the Contemplative Call, First Steps on the Mystical Path. A really, really wonderful book. Very easy to read, and lots of really wonderful wisdom in it.
Tom, may I
yeah.
step in here for a moment?
Yeah, sure, Bob,
because
yeah.
This has been such a rich conversation. I think we could unpack almost every statement that we've looked at this evening and turn it into an entire evening. That's how rich, I would say, our conversation has been this evening. And I think it goes well beyond just becoming better Christians. It really goes to the heart of becoming a better human being.
Amen.
And
Amen.
What I have heard this evening is something that I strive in my own life to get a grasp on, in a sense, and that is, how do we find peace in the world? When we look inside ourselves, when we are with ourselves, what is that experience? And I would suggest that in our contemporary world, it's a very confusing experience, because so much of life is so confusing today. And yet, the contemplative life is a way to find a greater sense of peace in our life. And so, if that makes sense, if the contemplative life is about finding peace, to what end do we want to find peace? What good is that? Is it just that we feel a little more comfortable when we go to sleep at night? Does it mean we are a little more comfortable when we arise in the morning? Or does it mean that we have an opportunity, a greater opportunity, to express ourselves in the world? And so I would say that the contemplative life, as Carl, I think, has very importantly pointed out, is not just to find peace within ourselves so that we can go to sleep in a little easier way. Finding peace within ourselves is a way to wake up. Wake up to the wonder of life. Wake up to the wonder of the divine presence in the world. Wake up to the possibilities that God places before us every day. That parking spot for our soul.
Yeah.
And if we just take the opportunity to become more peaceful in our life, we are missing also the opportunity to be more active in our life. And that, I believe, is what peace offers us. The ability to act in the world. Every Friday night at the religious service that I conduct to introduce the Sabbath, we say, we cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end racism. We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end hunger. We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to find peace in the world, world peace. We have to do something. And I think what silence calls us to account for is ourselves and what we do in the world. I went to Fiddler on the Roof last Sunday afternoon, playing in Sandy Springs, big production there, very lavish production. One of the songs in that production is L'chaim, which is the Hebrew word for life. And it's a drinking song, you know. People are lifting
I
their
have a
glasses.
story about that.
Yeah, lifting their glasses and drinking to life. Well, I would say that that is what the contemplative life calls us to do. It calls us to raise our glasses to life, to do instead of merely to pray. So there are so many more ideas in this conversation this evening that can be explored, and I think that that is what also the richness of the contemplative life is. The more we are with ourselves, the more we see needs to be done.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Carl, you got just a response to that? That was good stuff, Bob.
Well, yeah, that there's so much there. The one thing I will say about the piece is that, again, like everything else, I think there's a long game at play here. And I think many people, when they enter into a contemplative practice like centering prayer or meditation, oftentimes find that their hearts are anything but peaceful. Their hearts are chaotic. There's lots going on, you know, it feels distracted. I think it was Teresa of Avila who said it's like they're wild horses. You know, the Buddhists called it the monkey mind. You know, and so I think that this is not a contradiction, but I think, again, it's this long game, and that we have chaotic minds and hearts because we live in a chaotic world. And so we are invited into our own inner chaos as a way to be called to bring peace to the chaotic world that we are immersed in. How can we be agents of peace, agents of reconciliation, agents of justice, agents of, to use a Jewish concept, of repairing the world with wherever we are called to be? And so I do believe we're called into peace, but I do believe sometimes we're called to, you know, to borrow from Thich Nhat Hanh, we're called to be peace, which means that we sometimes are called to step right into the fire. And that can be painful and scary. But again, I think out of that place of prayer, it can be done with trust and with commitment.
That's good. That is good. Well, we are just about at the end of our time, but what I would like, Carl, for you to do, tell us about your new book, or at least the new edition of your new book, of your old book, new edition of. I have the old book. This is the old version of the book. It was called The Big Book of Christian Mysticism,
And
subtitled The Essential Guide to Contemplative Spirituality. And now Carl has
the very creatively named The New Big Book
Big
of
Book.
Christian Mysticism, an essential guide to contemplative spirituality. So it is a second edition, but it is an expanded edition. Like I was telling Tom, the old edition is 300 pages, the new edition is 400 pages. There are 5 new chapters. There is a much more expanded, just people are like, well, what's the difference? A much more expanded look at the relationship between spirituality and social justice, looking at the history of mysticism, including the Jewish and the Greek kind of, sources for Christian spirituality. There's a chapter on eroticism, which can maybe be a little surprising for people, but I do think, look at the Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible, that there is, God wants to be present even in our intimacy with our beloved.
That's why you were talking about Bernard of Clairvaux earlier. Okay.
Yeah, Bernard and his sermons on the song. Yeah, you got it. Do you know the Song of Songs is the most quoted book among the Christian mystics?
I did not know that, but I'm not surprised.
It is the most quoted book. So yeah, so there are 5 new chapters, but every existing chapter has been revised and in many cases expanded. So, but it's a book. It's not like an academic book. It's not something you have to have a PhD to read. It's written very from a down to earth perspective, but it's really for ordinary folks like you and me. I mean, not necessarily people who identify as Christian. It's really for everybody, but anybody who is interested in the Christian tradition of mystical spirituality and what it might have to say to us here in the 21st century. So that's the book.
Yeah. So if I want to buy this book, how do I do it? Should I go to your website, or should I go just straight on to Amazon, or go to your local bookseller, or what?
There is no bad way to buy one of my books. So all of the above is good. If you want an autographed copy, the Cathedral Bookstore in Atlanta has autographed copies of my books. Ignatius House, the Jesuit Retreat Center, has autographed copies of my books, or you can order them directly on my website, anamkara.com. But if your local bookstore is carrying it, great, support them. If they're not carrying it, ask them to carry it, ask them to special order it. That's great too. If you like to shop online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, any of the online retailers, yeah, there's no bad way to buy a book. It's all part of the cause, so we appreciate it. So
one of the other things I would say here is that the contemplative life is also a life that we find beyond words. I'm struck when I look at the background here that you, as well as myself, have a very large bookshelf, and both of you are, as I am, awash in books. And I'm always ask myself when I find a book I want to buy, where am I going to put it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I would say that the contemplative life is accessing who we are beyond the world of words.
Amen.
Beyond all of the intellectual concepts that are enshrined in those very neatly arranged books in the background.
Mm-hmm.
It is a way, in a sense, of finding who we were before we could speak. I'm so fascinated by the way that infants communicate, because they don't have a clear sense of language and a clear sense of how to express themselves in words, and yet they express themselves to us in ways that touch our hearts as deeply as we are ever touched. In the way an infant reaches out to you with those little fingers, those little barely formed fingers there that are so new, is a kind of a lesson to us. How can we find who we are beneath all these words and concepts and these great intellectual traditions that we have absorbed, not just through our own life, but through the lives of so many others, many of whom that you've mentioned this evening. But how do we find who we are underneath all of that?
Yeah.
And I would say that is perhaps also a goal of the contemplative life.
And, this brings us full circle, right back to the very beginning of our conversation when we were talking about the mute button on our phone. And that mysticism invites us into silence. It invites us into that place deeper than language. And so I think that's a beautiful way to end. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, Carl, and in the spirit of, we've been talking about prayer in one form or another for this whole time. I would like to invite you, if you would close us in prayer, in whatever way or form you feel led to.
Well, I'm going to offer a very short little prayer that comes from one of my favorite mystics, a woman who lived in England in the 1300s named Julian of Norwich. So the prayer goes like this. My friends, let us pray. O God of your goodness, give us yourself, for you are enough for us. We can ask for nothing less that is fully to your honor. And if we were to ask for anything else, we would be left in want. It is only in you that we have all. Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, Carl, thank you again so much for being with us tonight and sharing your insights. It's been great, and it's always fun. Always fun to talk with you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here and engaging. And I'm just very grateful. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.